Some of the first major writings on the topic of periodization were published around the 1950s by Laszlo Nadori. So that's one of the things we need to realize is the history of periodization and that it was generally designed to peak athletes for national events, Olympic qualifiers, and the Olympics. And it was mostly implemented on athletes in individual sports, so track and field, gymnastics, endurance competitions, etc. And many of these things were very, very rigid plans that allowed for very little fluidity or flexibility in terms of how they were implemented. Now, numerous authors have made contributions to the whole concept of periodization and program planning and organization, and some of the key names are here, and some of their associated textbooks can be seen towards the bottom. Modern periodization is generally considered to be a combination of different classical periodization models. Remember that periodization simply is pre-planned variation in training, and so all we're doing nowadays is proper program planning, which involves elements of linear, conjugate, block, so on and so forth. That said, even though modern planning is a combination of many aspects of different classical periodization models, there's still value in appreciating the definition and the basic tenets of each of the original periodization models. And so some of the models that we're going to go through can be seen here: linear, reverse linear, undulating, and fluid, as well as block, conjugate, and concurrent periodization. Now, these are titled as distinct periodization models, and the names being distinct are either determined by the loading strategy that's used within the model or the program structure that's used within the model. So some of the names that are closely associated with the loading strategy can be seen on the left here. So linear, reverse linear, undulating, or wave, or fluid / autoregulated. Some of the programs or periodization models that are named based on the program structure can be seen on the right. Linear also has a rigid structure if you're using linear, block, conjugate, and concurrent. Now, from a program structure perspective, what I'm referring to is how many goals are being trained or targeted at one particular time or within one particular mesocycle. And so some of these program structure models are considered to be a targeted approach to training. That is, all resources, so training resources, adaptive resources, etc., are all dedicated to developing one particular training goal. At the opposite end of the spectrum, then, is a purely concurrent approach where multiple training goals are addressed simultaneously within the same microcycle or mesocycle. There are pros and cons to a targeted approach and pros and cons to a concurrent approach. And those can be seen here. The green is highlighting the positive aspects of the approach, and the red is highlighting the potential drawbacks of the approach. So from a targeted perspective, yeah, focusing all of your training resources on the development of one goal is likely to bring about large improvements in that particular goal. This is just the specificity principle and the overload principle. However, there's a potential drawback to this, and that is that at any particular point in time, there are going to be certain goals that are just not developed. And so if you think about the long season of a team sport athlete, this might not be ideal for them to have certain periods of the year where power is not necessarily being developed or optimized. Also, detraining can occur if a previously attained adaptation is not maintained via an adequate training stimulus. For example, if I was to do a maximum strength mesocycle for 6 weeks with a group of athletes, and then we transition into our power mesocycle, and that was to last another 6 weeks. Well, during the 6-week power mesocycle, when we're not doing any maximum strength work, it's quite possible and likely that we will lose some maximum strength. And of course, we spent 6 weeks on developing maximum strength, so this might not be ideal. The other potential issue is staleness or monotonous of training. If you spend an extended period of time in certain training parameters chasing after one goal, then that stimulus may lose its novelty or its potency, and we might get into a little bit of staleness when it comes to training. Now, the concurrent approach has some positive aspects as well, and that is that it's focusing on developing multiple goals simultaneously. And so we're likely to experience, on a constant basis, small improvements in each goal. So if we go back to our team sport example, this might be more of an appropriate approach for team sports where we're always developing a little bit of strength, a little bit of power, and a little bit of ballistic qualities. On the downside, though, because you are spreading your training resources over multiple goals, it's very likely that no particular goal will be maximized. Finally, we try to link some of this stuff to training age, which we will at the end of the presentation, we can think that, well, individuals of intermediate or advanced training status do require more specificity for adaptation. So for these individuals, maybe spreading our training resources over multiple goals isn't the best or most effective way to bring about the adaptation that we're looking for. We're now going to take a deeper look into some of the basic aspects of various periodization models. And so if we start off with linear, we know that linear is a targeted approach to training, and it uses linear loading. And it's a very rigid structure. So as soon as somebody is in a linear program and decides to switch out the set and rep schemes to get out of the particular set and rep schemes that are conducive to the mesocycle in question, then it automatically is no longer linear periodization. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say we're in a maximum strength phase and we decide, well, let's put in a little bit of plyometrics just to get the athlete ready for the power phase that's coming up. Well, instantly that nullifies this as being a non-linear approach. So this would no longer be linear. The question is, does that really matter? You know, if you're looking at from a needs analysis perspective and you like the targeted approach afforded by linear, you like the linear loading aspect, and you just want to sprinkle in some plyos as a preparation, what does it matter whether or not you can call this a linear program or not? Undulating periodization is mostly simply a loading strategy that could be implemented in a concurrent approach or a targeted approach to training. As a reminder then, on the top right-hand side, what wave periodization actually is, or wave loading, each peak is going to represent the beginning of a particular mesocycle. So in a mesocycle here, we have a high volume mesocycle, of course, combined with lower intensity. The next cycle will have higher intensity combined with lower volume, etc. What you're seeing on the top is an example of daily undulating periodization. So we do have each of our phases, our mesocycles, which are clearly targeted approaches. Then we have our microcycles. So you can see that in the introductory phase, we have 2 weeks of training. Now the cells are split into 3 each. So this is going to be 3 days of training per week. And the loading on this one is a light day, this is a medium day, and this is a heavy day. So the associated reps are going to be 20, 15, and 12. Then you might say, well, 12 is not heavy at all because we're lifting loads that we can use, do 12 reps of. But in this particular microcycle, this week, this is the heavy day compared to the other 2 training sessions. And then this pattern is just repeating itself of a light, moderate, and heavy day all through the entire program. Repetitions, of course, you can see how they have changed in the hypertrophy phase. So 10-8-6, 10-8-6, 10-8-6, etc. Strength, we're using reps that are more conducive to strength. And then power, what we're seeing is different percentages. Reminder that power has that velocity component. So we'll be moving 60% of the 1RM extremely fast, attempting to move 75% of the 1RM extremely fast. B is referring to ballistic type work, which is med ball and plyometrics. On the bottom, we're seeing a weekly undulating model. And so we're still targeted, but we are undulating the loads each week. And so you can see that in our introductory phase, we're having 2 weeks, right? 2 microcycles. We're having a light and moderate microcycle. So 15 reps for 1 week, 10 reps the next. Hypertrophy, we're on 12 and 8. So even though this looks kind of linear, when we spend a little bit more time bouncing between our strength and power mesocycles, you'll see 6, 4, then we're on 5-3, 5-3, 4-2 with associated loadings. This is an example of undulating periodization, but in a concurrent approach. So what we've done is we've changed the mesocycle names to simply reflect phase 1, phase 2, 3, and 4. We have our microcycles listed here, our loadings of light, medium, heavy, of course, alternating all throughout the program. And then we have our rep schemes. And so you can see that even in phase 1, we have 12, 8, and 6. So this is more general prep introductory stuff with our 12 reps. And then 8 and 6 may be a little bit more conducive to hypertrophy. But then you can see how the undulations change. We have 11, 7, 5, 10, 6, 4. So obviously on our day where we are doing 10 repetitions, that's a little bit more conducive to hypertrophy. 6 and 4 is a little bit more conducive to strength. And remember, these are happening within the same week, right? So it is daily undulating, but we are now spanning multiple goals. And then things change a little bit here where in phase 3, you can see this week is labeled as P. This is going to be power, so explosive type stuff for 5 reps. There's P again, so power, explosive type stuff for 4 reps, so on and so forth. But as you can see then, undulating periodization really is mostly a loading strategy. And it just depends on what are you doing? Are you having a concurrent approach to training or a targeted approach? That's why I suggest on this particular slide, is it really periodization? We know that what we've looked at right now have been primarily two different loading strategies, right? Linear loading, undulated loading. But then the interesting thing is that we have the principle of progressive overload. And so even though we might be undulating our loads on every mesocycle, we still need to adhere to the principle of progressive overload. And so if we were to actually zoom out and see how is intensity really changing over the cycle, you'll see that intensity is linearly increasing. For example, this might be the client using 100 pounds. This might be the client using 70 pounds. The next time they move back into their higher intensity phase, well, we've built some strength, so maybe they're using 105. Then the next time we're in our higher intensity phase, they're now using 110. And so you can see how things aren't as distinct as they seem to be. Concurrent periodization is exactly what we had introduced previously, which is where multiple goals are being focused on at the similar time frame, and the emphasis on each goal is actually equal. And so that's why you can see that for the entire 12-week program here, we have an equal emphasis on developing basic strength, anatomical adaptation, etc., hypertrophy, maximum strength, and power. Conjugate periodization is designed to make up for some of the potential pitfalls of the linear or targeted approach and the purely concurrent approach. And remember that one of the key pitfalls of the linear type of periodization was that we're only focusing on one particular goal at a time. And so there's certain adaptations that are not being developed at certain times. And then there's also that possibility of detraining a previously attained adaptation. Concurrent, though, potentially took it too far and said, let's spread our resources out over each goal equally. And Conjugate suggested, well, no, why can't we just focus on a particular goal in a cycle while still having a nominal stimulus for other adaptations? This way we can focus on getting a pretty decent training stimulus and then a small training stimulus for certain things. And this obviously should completely avoid the possibility of detraining. So let's look over in our maximum strength phase, in our power phase. Even though we're in our power phase, and this could be extended to a 4-week cycle, we have a little bit of max strength work in there, a little bit of hypertrophy work in there, a little bit of general physical prep in there. So again, we're focusing on developing or maximizing power as our goal, but we're not going to have any detraining in any other aspects. One of the key aspects of block periodization is that it has unique names for the mesocycles. Rather than using goal-oriented names, the names are a little bit more generic. And so the first cycle that we'll see in a blocked approach is called the accumulation phase. The second one is called transmutation or intensification. And the last one is a realization block. And so I've given a brief explanation as to what happens in each of these cycles. The accumulation block is designed to accumulate high volume. And so from a set and rep scheme, we can realize that this is mostly that general physical prep stuff, the introductory phase and hypertrophy type work. The transmutation phase is based upon the fact that the previously developed adaptation, such as hypertrophy, in and of itself doesn't help sport performance. Just having larger muscles doesn't make you a better athlete. However, having larger muscles sets you up to be a stronger person. But what actually improves athleticism is going to be increasing strength and increasing power. So the point of the transmutation phase is to transmutate or transfer the previously attained adaptation of hypertrophy into the usable adaptation, which is strength and introducing some power stuff. This is why it's also considered intensification, right? The intensity of training is increasing in the transmutation block. Intensity as in the load lifted relative to the 1RM to develop strength, and intensity in terms of velocity of contraction and the neural requirements to perform explosive contractions. Finally, the last block is a realization block. And this is where the previously attained adaptations are fully realized. This is really based upon the concept of tapering and that fatigue masks fitness. So if we can reduce some of the accumulated training fatigue while still keeping a stimulus for ballistic type qualities, then the athlete can peak for their competition. Block training has some unique features associated with it, but I put a question mark over here because, as we will discuss on the next slide, are these features unique to block periodization, or are these just things that are a part of proper program planning now that we have years and years of more of research and anecdotal evidence regarding proper planning for sport performance? But some of these specific unique features that are explained in Block Periodization, which is the seminal text by Vladimir Isrin, are aspects and things such as concentrated loading, delayed transformation, training residuals, and peaking. And we'll explain exactly what each of these are on the next slide. But block periodization is the only model that has built-in taper cycles, the realization block. And so this ends up, again, kind of muddying the waters in terms of categorizing programs based on the tenets of certain periodization models. Because if you include a taper, but you're using a conjugate program, would that now be considered a block program? And again, ultimately, it doesn't matter. We're really just arguing semantics at this point. One of the reasons that block was designed was to help people to have multiple peaks throughout the season. As a reminder, periodization, a lot of the original stuff was designed around national competitions, Olympic qualifiers, Olympic events, etc., for individual athletes. And so here's an example of how a blocked approach might be planned out to have an athlete compete or peak for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 competitions. So what you can see is we would have our 4-week mesocycle of accumulation. That's what you're seeing in these numbers here are actually weeks. And then these are the competition dates. So we'll have 4 weeks of accumulation, 4 weeks of transmutation, 1 week taper, and then they compete. Then we will simply repeat the process. We mentioned on the previous slide that there are unique features associated with block periodization. So let's explain what these are. One of the first ones is concentrated loading. And so concentrated loading is really referring to shock microcycles or functional overreaching. These are periods of higher overload for a particular goal designed to maximize the adaptation for that particular goal. But I would argue that this is nothing unique to block periodization. Is just the application of physiology, right? We know that if we're looking at baseline here, if we overload the system, we will stimulate a certain degree of adaptation. And if we overload the system a little bit more, we stimulate a greater degree of adaptation. And a really good example of this is when we talk about going to altitude. One of the key adaptations when we go into altitude and experience a hypoxic scenario is that the body increases its number of red blood cells. And so if we were to go and experience a little bit of a hypoxic challenge, we will stimulate a little bit of erythropoiesis, which is the increase in red blood cells. But if we were to go into higher altitude and have a greater hypoxic challenge, we're stimulating a greater increase in the number of red blood cells. So this is just a basic physiological fact, and block periodization just happened to, kind of properly categorize it. If you happen to be in a linear approach, does that mean that you couldn't use a shock microcycle and all of a sudden it becomes block? Again, we're just back to this whole semantics thing that really in the grand scheme of programming doesn't matter. The concept of delayed transformation is where appreciation for the fact that adaptations will take time to be fully realized. Full adaptation from a particular goal is only realized once the overload for that goal has been reduced. So for example, if we happen to be in a strength phase, maximum strength phase, we stimulate all of these increases in our 1RM, we won't fully see the maximum results from that particular phase until we have decreased the amount of training stress associated with developing maximum strength. So once we get into our power phase and we are seeing a decrease in the volume of that pure heavy maximum strength work, we will finally see our 1RM peak. Now, this really is kind of an idea around deloading, right? We know that if we have an accumulation of training fatigue, that we need to reduce that degree of overload to have adaptations fully come through. Training residuals is an appreciation for the fact that if an adaptation is not trained, it will be lost, and that each adaptation has a different time frame for detraining. So in Isrin's text, for example, he suggests that we have about 30 days before we will lose any type of strength. So you could go 30 days without addressing your maximum strength and you should not experience detraining. And so this is why very common is a 4-week cycle. If we have 4-week phases, 4-week blocks, 4-week cycles, we're likely to not experience significant decreases in muscle size or strength, etc. However, for power, it was suggested to have a residual of about 15 days or so. Some suggest it's even as low as 7, that if you don't include explosive type work at least once every 7 days, you can experience a slight detraining. But again, is this anything unique to block, right? If everyone knows that if you don't train an adaptation, you're likely to lose it. So again, block just kind of formalized this concept of training residuals. Finally, the aspect of peaking, we know that fatigue masks fitness. And so block periodization does respect this by having a built-in tapering phase, which is called realization. But again, if you're doing daily undulating periodization in a targeted approach, it's just sound programming to plan for a deload if required. So again, another aspect that might not be as unique to block as once thought. Trying to apply all of this stuff then to modern program design, I really like this quote from strength coach Ron McKeefery. The means and methods may change, but the training principles are timeless. So as long as we are adhering to the principle of progressive overload, specificity, variation, recovery, individuality, etc., those are the things that are going to create a successful program, not necessarily the rigid implication or application of dated periodization models. Further, it can just be really confusing trying to classify a program into a specific type of periodization. For example, let's say our client has the singular goal of hypertrophy. So this is the plan that we have put forth. So it makes sense that the entire 12-week program would be titled a hypertrophy mesocycle. We can see that we're going to be doing 3 sets for the most part for each exercise for the 12 weeks, but the rep schemes are going to change. The first 4 weeks looks like we have 12s, 10s, 8s, and 6s. So that looks like a very linear approach. This is targeted, so we could say, yeah, we're doing linear periodization. But then our next phase, we're just going to repeat. So we're going to go 12, 10, 8, and 6. We're trying to appeal to that rep range, 6 to 12, that's most conducive to hypertrophy. But then if you took a snapshot of weeks 3 to 7, that actually looks like it's maybe undulating, right? 8, 6, back up to 12s, 10, 8. So now the question is, well, are you really doing linear or are you doing undulating? At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. Also, we said this is a targeted approach to training, but plyometrics have been shown to increase hypertrophy in the lower limbs, suggested to due to the high forces involved with the stretched position. However, the mechanisms do not matter, but if I've come across this research and I'm thinking, yeah, this is another way we can stimulate hypertrophy, so let's put a little bit of plyos in there as well. So maybe we introduce plyos in week number 8. Well, someone looks at it and says, well, plyos are actually pretty decent for power, so you're not doing a targeted approach anymore. This is no longer linear. This is now conjugate. Again, that does not matter, right? Classifying the program as being a certain type of periodization literally makes no difference to the training adaptations. It's quite common for people to try to apply different periodization models to different training ages, suggesting a beginner should be on X type of periodization, and as you become advanced, you need to move to a different type of periodization. But this confuses things and doesn't really end up with clear-cut answers. Because if we think about beginners versus advanced clients from a training status perspective, who needs more specificity to get the desired adaptation? Well, that's going to be our advanced person. What type of program has the most specificity? Well, that's going to be our targeted approach, and linear would fall into that. But then who needs more variation? The advanced person. And which of these models has the least amount of variation? The targeted approach, which happens to be linear. And then we think who gets away with very minimal stimuli in order to get adaptations? Well, that happens to be the beginner. And which type of program gives you minimal stimuli? It's going to be the concurrent approach. And so you can see how confusing it is, because if you look this up, many people think the beginner should be on a linear program, and as you build your training age, you move over to concurrent or conjugate. So you can see how a lot of that stuff just doesn't really make any sense. Going back to individual program design and the daily workouts, etc., it's generally accepted that the elements of the workout for an athlete are seen on the right-hand side here. And so we start out with our warm-up, of course. Then we're looking at speed. So it could be acceleration, top end speed, and agility or change of direction. Very, very light power work. So this stuff is done extremely fast. This is our jump training. This is our med ball work. Then we might have heavier power stuff. So we're still trying to move the weight fast, but this is going to be heavier things such as cleans, snatches, the Olympic lift variations. We might have some maximal strength work in there. So down around 4 reps, 5 reps, and 6 reps for certain patterns. And then we will also have just our general strength type work. So our 3 sets of 8, 3 sets of 10 for certain patterns, and then finishing with conditioning. And for athletes or our general population clients, then we simply omit what we don't need, right? We're going to tailor the loaded power work to something that they can perform. We'll probably get away from speed and agility, change of direction, and things of that nature. So if this is generally accepted as the athletic development requirements, then you can see that from an athletic perspective, you're pretty much always concurrent or conjugate. Applying all this stuff to general population clients, we can see that one of the things we've previously presented is simply having a linear progression that you repeat over time. So it could be a 4-week 12 rep phase, then a 4-week phase of 10 reps and a 4-week phase of 8 reps. Then you just continue to repeat that pattern. Obviously, the loads the client uses the next time they're in the 12 rep phase are going to be heavier than the first time they were in the 12 rep phase because they've built up strength. Or for the same type of general population client, we can simply use an undulated style. So we have a phase of 12 reps, then we go to 8, 12, 8, and again, we just keep repeating this for the duration that we are training this particular client. We can add a little more variation if we want to, depending where we want to go with it. So here's an example of starting out with 15 reps and then 8 reps, getting down to 12, and then getting down to 6. Would not have to be 4-week cycles. They could be 2 weeks. They could be 3 weeks. It really doesn't matter. Getting back to the concept of phase potentiation, multiple training qualities and goals are supportive of others, and so whether they're developed linearly or concurrently, they can be supportive. So if you're developing hypertrophy and maximum strength simultaneously, they will support each other, and if you happen to develop them linearly, of course, they support each other. There are a couple other models that were listed in the introductory slide that we did not touch upon, so I'll give a brief insight into what these things are about. Reverse linear is exactly what it sounds like. We are going to use linear periodization setup, but we're going to implement it in reverse. So in this case, we actually start with the speed and power phase, then move to strength, then hypertrophy, then endurance. This is suggested to be a little bit better for athletes that are involved in endurance competitions. Fluid or auto-regulated periodization is really a program where auto-regulation is used to guide the session. I think it could be argued that this isn't a specific type of periodization. This is just a program that utilizes auto-regulation. Auto-regulation, for example, if on Monday we'd planned a heavy day, and Wednesday was a moderately heavy day, and Friday was our light day. Client comes in to see us, and on Monday, they're just not feeling all that great. They didn't sleep that well. We're just asking them, right? How'd you sleep last night? Like, not that great. Have any muscle soreness? Like, yeah, I'm still a little bit tight from Friday's workout. And then we, anxious for today's session. Like, you know what? Honestly, I'm just pretty beat up. I don't feel like training today. We might auto-regulate, which is the automatic regulation of today's session, or be fluid with our planning and say, you know what? We're not going to do the heavy day today. We're actually going to do our moderately heavy day today, and then move the heavy day to Wednesday. The concept being here, the adaptations really shouldn't be all that different as long as we get our heavy, moderate, and light session in over our 7-day period. Westside conjugate periodization was designed by Louis Simmons in order to maximize powerlifting performance. And so right there, a lot of strength coaches in the world of athleticism, so hockey, soccer, football, etc., would say, we're not looking at Westside at all because it was designed for powerlifting. However, other types of strength coaches will look and say, well, there are some really good aspects here that could develop athleticism. Specifically then, the Westside conjugate model involved this. For the lower body and upper body, one time in the microcycle, so once a week, there would be a maximum strength day followed by some hypertrophy work. There would also be a power or speed day followed by some hypertrophy work. So for example, if we're talking lower body, we might use some type of squat variation, loaded it up for 3 repetitions, and then the remainder of the workout would be filled with lower body stuff, maybe 3 sets of 8, 3 sets of 10. The power or speed day might be a lower body variation of a squat. We're going to be doing that for maybe 6, 7 sets of 3, but those reps will be performed extremely, extremely fast. And then the remainder of that workout is 8 to 10 reps. Now, another aspect of Westside was that the main lifts were rotated quite frequently based on the training age. The other main thing about Westside is they never trained the competition lifts. So they rarely ever did a pure competition bench press, a pure competition deadlift, or a pure competition squat. It would be a variation of one of these lifts that would have good transfer to the actual lift. Finally, parallel periodization, which is another name for concurrent periodization. Another one of the criticisms of trying to follow a rigid periodization model is that it's such a zoomed out plan that it itself might not have massive implications in terms of the adaptations that are experienced from training. Because what stimulates the adaptations, of course, are the principle of progressive overload, specificity, variation, etc. Break the system down, apply the type of stress that you want, and then experience that adaptation. How you organize your phases, potentially a little bit less impactful than what you actually do in the individual workouts. The other thing we know is that there's no or very little exclusivity across rep ranges. So even when we're in our maximum strength phase, we can see that doing sets of 4 to 6 repetitions is still a pretty decent hypertrophy stimulus. And when we're in our hypertrophy phase, right, let's say we end with 6 repetitions, well, that's a pretty decent strength stimulus. We're looking to summarize this stuff then. It's not that the historical periodization models are not important. They are, but we have now moved to a point in sports science where we've taken the positive aspects of each of these. We can appreciate the potential drawbacks of each of these, and we've taken these concepts and we simply apply them to current program planning. So at the end of the day, just be sure that we're following the training principles: overload, specificity, variation, individuality, recovery, reversibility. Obviously, we're going to keep continuing to appreciate the training age of our client and trying to match the amount of variation, specificity, etc. to that. And we're also considering the goals of the clients. Are there multiple goals that need to be developed, or are we going to focus solely on a particular goal? But I think you're going to fall into a really, really confused state if you try to categorize a program based on whether or not it is linear, conjugate, concurrent, so on and so forth. And the categorization has zero impact on the actual adaptations that we experience. Finally, this was a little Twitter back and forth between 2 great strength coaches. On the top, we have Michael Boyle, and then on the bottom, we have Lauren Goldenberg. Some of their highlights of who they are on the left-hand side here. Collectively, I said about 70 years of strength and conditioning experience. It's probably more. But Mike Boyle had tweeted, the whole periodization thing is overrated. And Lauren Goldenberg replied, I looked at over 20 papers on periodization for a presentation. Some models showed minimal improvement over others, but nothing of such significance that was earth-shattering. Moral of the story, use what works for you with solid program variables.